Well, hello, logic class. Here we are nearing the very end of our course. I hope that you're all doing well, staying safe, and definitely miss not getting to see all of you in class. So we're going to jump into this together. So we'll be talking about fallacies of distraction together, lesson 33. Only one lesson this week. You only have got one piece of homework that you're going to be doing this week, so it should be an easier week as we've come to Resurrection Sunday week as well. So lesson 33 is on informal fallacies. I want to say just a couple of words about it as we get started. Informal fallacies are popular, invalid, unhelpful forms of reasoning. Studying and responding to such mistakes is an important employment of the lessons you've learned this year in this class. So we've done a lot of work talking about establishing here in recent days, establishing good conclusions, valid conclusions on the basis of true premises. We're going to talk about some invalid ways of reasoning and why these forms of reasoning are bad. There are three main divisions of informal fallacies. There are those fallacies of distraction, which we'll be talking about today. And then there are fallacies of ambiguity and fallacies of form, which we'll be talking about next week. So these divisions are for convenience, not to make absolute authoritative classifications. Each of these fallacies are such due to how they are used. It is possible to reason rightly while using some of these arguments. So you're going to see with me that context becomes crucial, which means that we have to employ wisdom as we're interacting with these sorts of forms of reasoning. Some of these are absolutely invalid. They're fallacious ways of reasoning, but I'm also going to point out some ways in which even these same forms do not fall into a fallacy. So we'll see these examples together. So these fallacies of distraction, the ones we'll be talking about today, are arguments which point us to information that seems relevant to the conclusion, but really is not relevant. They're called the fallacy of distraction because they're distracting attention away from the argument that is being made. So it's usually a way to kind of get around what the person's actually trying to say. And a lot of these are utilized in public debates, for example, where let's say that one person is kind of under fire by his opponent through a line of reasoning. He might avoid the entire line of argumentation by introducing a fallacy of distraction. And you'll see here that a lot of these are used, and you probably even have used some of these yourself, and we're going to try to get to the heart of what's wrong with them and how we can avoid them and how we can point them out when someone else is engaging in one of these forms of fallacious reasoning. So the first one we'll look at is Ipse Dixit. That's Latin for he has said it himself. And the problem with this line of reasoning is that it's an illegitimate appeal to authority. The issue is the legitimacy of the appeal. The argument is valid but unsound if a premise is false. If the authority is legitimate and relevant, then there's no fallacy at all. But if it's an illegitimate authority, it's not a relevant source of authority, then it's an instance of Ipse Dixit. So argument by authority is an unavoidable reality. But the question here is the authority appealed to a legitimate authority? So let's look at an example. So here's some Ipse Dixit examples. So there's an actor who comes on the TV, and he's got this white lab coat on, and he explains what the best toothpaste is. We've all seen these things. Sometimes there may even be famous celebrities who endorse certain products. And we're meant to think through that, and sadly a lot of us do, that it must be true because that famous celebrity has said that it's true. But they might have not a shred of scientific or any other reasoning that's justifying the decision. They're just using the basis of the fact that that person said it, that you should also agree with it. So this is a case of Ipse Dixit. Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, saying that there is no creator. Let's say that an atheist says, well, Richard Dawkins says there is no creator, so there isn't a creator. That's a case of Ipse Dixit. Now, in this case, they might argue that Richard Dawkins is much more knowledgeable than a lot of other people. And he might be knowledgeable in some senses, but just because he says there is no creator doesn't mean that there isn't a creator. Or the Supreme Court declaring same-sex unions as marriage. Again, we would argue as Christians that the Supreme Court in these matters has transgressed. It's gone beyond its proper sphere of authority. For only God, who is the designer, creator, a sustainer of marriage. Only he can define what marriage is. Although we live in a country that has now said that same-sex unions are marriage, we would disagree with that, and we would say that if somebody said, well, the Supreme Court says that it's marriage, we would say it's a case of Ipse Dixit, because they're an illegitimate authority on that matter. All right, the second form of fallacy of distraction would be ad populum. This fallacy makes an appeal to the masses. That's to the people, the way that can be translated. The issue here is that the argument is based on the mere mass of the masses, not to aspects of mankind which the masses have or which are legitimate to appeal to. So it's not that there's something wrong with appealing to a lot of people, but there is something wrong with saying that something must be true or right just because a lot of people are engaged in it or believe it. So a couple of examples. The story must be great. It's a bestseller. Well, just because a book has sold a lot of copies, does that necessarily mean that it's a good story? No, not at all. There could be other reasons that are causing the book to sell a lot of copies. It might still be a pretty horrible book. And you might know some of those examples of best-selling books that you would say had pretty horrible stories associated. Maybe you've used this before, but Mom, everyone's going to this movie, so why can't I go? And certainly probably in those cases, your mom has provided you with a counterexample saying, well, if everybody jumped off a cliff, would you jump off too? Again, the point is, just because a lot of people are doing something doesn't mean that it's right? Remember back in the day when the Exodus account is happening and all of Israel wants to go back to Egypt, and Moses is saying, no, the Lord has told us to flee and to go into the promised land. Again, if they listened to the masses, if the populace was the justifier of what is right, they would have been going back to Egypt. But that wasn't the mere mass of people wanting a course of action doesn't make that thing a right thing. Okay, a third form of fallacy of distraction is ad baculum. This is the fallacy that makes an appeal to the stick. That's what that literally means, to the stick. This is an argument by use of illegitimate threat. The question comes down to here, is the authority legitimate and is the goal of the threat proper? So something that would not be ad baculum fallacy would be like your parent telling you, no, you can't engage in that behavior. And if you do, there's going to be consequences. You'll be grounded, there'll be a spanking, there'll be whatever it is that they say is the punishment if you should not do that. Now, they are your legitimate authority, and the goal of parenting, at least in general, should be for your good and for God's glory. And so if those things are in play, then it's not an ad baculum argument for them to say, I don't think it's a good idea that you do that, and if you do it, these are going to be the consequences that are associated with that. It's just as if someone was to say to another person, well, even if you don't see the wisdom of our laws against murder, perhaps you'll be influenced by the reality of the death penalty. In other words, our country carries the right of the stick as it relates to carrying out the death penalty on someone who has committed murder, and that's supposed to be a deterrent against them doing it. So even if they don't agree with the law, perhaps the punishment that comes to them should they disobey will at least convince them to go along with it. That's not ad baculum, because in those cases they're a legitimate authority with a proper goal in mind. But here's a couple of examples of ad baculum. Someone saying, if you don't vote for Senator Smith, the ozone layer will be destroyed in 6 months and we're all going to die. So whatever your theory or opinion about the ozone layer and environmental conditions upon that are, we can at least all admit that whatever happens with this particular one senator is not going to make enough of a difference on the ozone layer such that even if we could die in 6 months, that would happen. So this is an illegitimate appeal to consequence that we're all going to die if you don't vote for this person, because within 6 months the ozone layer will be depleted unless Senator Smith is there in place. This is an illegitimate form of reasoning. And again, but these sorts of arguments happen often, especially when it comes to political processes. Or someone says, if you don't buy these shoes, you'll be condemned to a life of mediocrity. Again, the concern that you're going to live a mediocre life if you don't get these newest and greatest shoes is an ad baculum argument. How could they tie those things together, and who are they to say that that's the case? So these are ad baculum arguments. The next one we're going to look at is one that you maybe have heard about before. Of all these Latin phrases, you've maybe heard of the ad hominem argument before. And this literally means to the man. And it's a fallacy of distraction because instead of interacting with a person's argument, you verbally attack them. So you get the attention off of the argument by talking about their character, about who they are, what they've done, or what they haven't done. And through this means you don't have to answer the argument that's being put before you. This fallacy is not always committed when a person is verbally attacked. It's only a legitimate argument if the person's character really is bad and that character is relevant to the discussion at hand. So, for example, it's not a case of ad hominem if a lawyer is making some questions regarding the credibility of an eyewitness to a particular crime. If that individual can be shown to be a liar, can be shown to be someone who doesn't uphold truth, then it would be right for the jury to not trust the testimony of the person who's putting forward their ideas. So there are cases in which it is not ad hominem to argue about the person's character because it is relevant to the discussion at hand. But at the same time, there are other times in which these sorts of arguments are not relevant, or they're not even true of the individual. It's just a distraction. So here's a couple of examples of ad hominem. Yes, we know that you maintain that the sun rises in the east every morning, but we also know that you were caught speeding in a school zone. Now, notice that these two things this is a purposeful example where you kind of see the contrastive element that you might ask the question, well, whether or not the sun rises in the east, how does that have any bearing on whether or not this person sped through a school zone and was caught for it? It might be true that they did speed through a school zone and they were caught and received consequences, but in what way, shape, or form does that impact the statement that the sun is rising in the east every morning? It really doesn't. And so in this case, this is an ad hominem sort of argument. Or how about this one? You've just argued that a healthy diet includes eating food from the main food groups in right proportion, but you're overweight. Again, it may be true in this case that the person is overweight who's trying to put forward health guidelines as to how we might better eat. But even if they are overweight, that doesn't necessarily negate the statements that they're making regarding healthy eating. So this is also an ad hominem. You're not actually interacting with the arguments at hand. You're not saying why you think their argument for health is a bad one. Instead, you're just saying, let's talk about you as a person and say, I don't have to actually listen to what you have to say because you don't comply with what you're talking about. So again, these are those types of ad hominem arguments where we're trying to distract away from the argument at hand through an attack on the person. And unless it's a legitimate thing that the person's actually done, and it somehow does specifically impact the testimony, the words that they're saying, in general, these are bad forms of argument because you're not actually dealing with the argument at hand. You're not just talking about the person. And again, these happen all the time in political contexts where people want to avoid talking about the subjects at hand and instead just talk about their opponent. All right, the fifth form of fallacy of distraction is called a Bulverism. Now, this term was originally coined by C.S. Lewis in his essay, God in the Dock. And what a Bulverism is, it's dismissing an argument by simply pointing out why the one presenting the argument came to believe it. Unless the person's reason for adopting an argument is truly relevant to your argument, it's a fallacy. So it doesn't matter how the person came to the position they're at. In general, you need to argue about the position that they're at. Now, there can be cases where a Bulverism isn't actually a Bulverism. So let's say, for example, someone starts running as a Republican, but they had been running as a Democrat before that, and now they're running as a Republican. And you're able to prove that the only reason why they're not running on a Republican platform is because they think they have a better chance of getting voted in. It's not that their actual philosophy of life or their morals or ethics or political stances have changed at all. They're just now running under a new platform because they think they can elect better underneath that one. That is not a case of Bulverism because you're saying that the only reason that you're now saying you're holding to these views is because of some other expediency, some advantage that gives you. But otherwise, the problem with this is, you're not arguing with their actual stance. You're saying that their stance doesn't really mean anything because of how they arrived at it. And let me show you a couple of examples. So for Bulverism examples, you have something like this. You're a Christian only because your parents raised you that way. Now, this is something that we may indeed hear from someone, where they discount our belief in Christ, they disbelieve our walk with the Lord, and they say that it doesn't really, what we believe or where we've come to, it doesn't really matter because we were raised in Christian homes, and that's just what our mom and dad taught us. That's a form of Bulverism, where you're saying, I'm not actually interacting with your claims regarding who Jesus is, I'm not interacting with your claims regarding the Bible. I'm just going to say what you believe doesn't really matter because you're only there because you were raised that way. Again, the problem with it is that you could turn the argument around, right, and say to the other person, well, you only believe what you believe because of where you got to, how you got to where you are now today as well, and how you were raised, and on the argument you go. Remember, this doesn't prove the validity or invalidity of a particular argument. You're distracting away from it by saying what the person actually holds doesn't matter because of how they got there. It's like someone saying, you're saying infants shouldn't be baptized only because you grew up in a Baptist home. And that's an unfair thing. Now, some of us, even in this class, might be at churches that baptize infants, and some of us might be in churches that do not do that. But the argument from either case is not merely, well, I was raised in a home this way, so that's why I do or don't do it this way. Our argument would want to be founded upon what the Bible teaches. And so those who either believe in paedobaptism or baptizing infants, or those who do not believe in paedobaptism, baptizing infants, but believe instead in believer's baptism, whichever stance you're coming from, your main argument comes from what you think God says in his word and what God has done historically or traditionally. And so allow those arguments to be the ones that we're talking about rather than being distracted away from that by saying, well, you were just raised this way, so that's why you believe it. That's a Bulverism, and that's a distraction from the argument. The sixth fallacy of distraction is tu quoque, which means, in essence, yeah, well, you too. Yes, you too, is what it's saying. The man guilty of this is pointing out an inconsistency between what his opponent says and what his opponent does, and uses that inconsistency as an excuse to ignore his opponent. Now, it is tu quoque only in the case in which the thing that's being talked about is a matter which is a wrong thing to do. So you can't establish the rightness of something just on the basis that the other person also does it wrong. In this case, two wrongs don't make a right. Just because somebody else does something wrong doesn't mean now that you can do it and it be okay, even though it's wrong, because the other person's also doing it wrong. It's not tu quoque if the thing we're talking about is a fine thing, whether you do it or not do it. So if someone says, you should read more fiction, and you respond, well, why should I read more fiction? You don't read any fiction. Again, that's not tu quoque in its essence, because there's nothing that would mandate us to read or not read fiction. But it is tu quoque in some other examples. Let me show you. For example, you can't preach at me regarding my sin when you're a sinner yourself. Again, the person arguing here is like, don't talk about sin because you also have sinned. That sort of argument is a fallacy of distraction. Just because the person saying don't sin has themselves sinned doesn't now make sin okay. So you can't argue back to the person, well, I don't have to listen to you because you've also been a sinner. It's like, well, that doesn't make sin right. Sin is still wrong, and I openly admit that. And I also am not trying to claim that I am somehow sinless. This is tu quoque. We're not actually interacting with the subject of sin. Instead, we're just interacting with the person saying, well, I don't have to listen to what you have to say because you've also been guilty of this very thing. Or you can't tell me to lie. You've lied before. Again, I'm sure all of us at some point have lied. And if you say you haven't, you're probably lying right now, right? But to say to someone else, well, don't tell me not to lie because you've lied before, that doesn't make your lies right. So this is a case of tu quoque. All right, seventh form is ad ignorantiam. This is a fallacy that makes an appeal to lack of information. This is an argument from silence. It's the argument that goes like this. Well, nobody has proven what I'm saying is false, therefore what I'm saying must be true. This is kind of that thing of like, unless you can prove me wrong, I'm right. And that's a false way of reasoning. As an example, UFOs must be alien spaceships because the government has never offered another satisfactory explanation. They must be this because the government hasn't offered anything else. You see the problem there? Just because they haven't offered an explanation that you think is satisfactory doesn't mean your conclusion is right. It's an argument from silence. It's an argument from ignorance. Just because we don't know any other thing doesn't mean the thing that you're proposing is correct. I don't know of a better way, so this must be right. Again, you might just be ignorant. There might be a right way, and you might be going a wrong way. Even though you just because you don't know a better way doesn't mean that your way is necessarily right. It could be a wrong way. It might be better than some of the other wrong ways, but it doesn't make it right. Now, a case that would not be adding in ignorantium would be like, for example, in a court of law, when a lawyer might say, I want to remind the jury that my client is innocent until proven guilty. See, in this case, we assume innocence in a court of law unless there's a preponderance of evidence that would say otherwise. And so an individual that is being examined in a court of law is presumed innocent. And so in this case, if you're ignorant of there being anything wrong in the person, if you're on the jury, you're supposed to declare them to be innocent unless proven guilty. So that would not be a case in this. All right, and eighth and finally, our last fallacy of distraction we'll talk about here is chronological snobbery. This is the rejection based solely upon the oldness or newness of something. Traditionalists are those who assume that just because something is old, it must be good. Whereas modernists are those who assume that because something is old, it must be bad. Or said the other way, modernists are those who would say that which is new is good. Now, the problem with these sorts of arguments is that if you're basing it purely on the amount of time in which the argument is being advanced or the thing you're talking about has been around, just on the basis of time alone, that's not a valid form of reasoning. The passage of time alone does not establish the truth of something. So just because it's older or just because it's newer doesn't mean that it's right. So here's a couple of examples. Categorical logic may have worked for Aristotle, but it's outdated now. So the idea that what we're engaging here in this course, well, that might have been good for some other year, but we're in a different time now, and this is no longer useful. Again, you might argue that for some series of reasons, something is a better approach to something, and that's then not strictly a chronological snobbery sort of situation. But just saying that something is old, and as a result of it being old, it must be not very good or not workable, that's not a valid form of reasoning. Or someone saying this latest technological advance must be good. Again, you see here, there might be advances in technology that are not very good. But those who claim that just because it's new, it must be better, would fall victim to this sort of argument. Or it could work the other way. If it worked for the church 100 years ago, it will work now. Now, this is more the traditionalist view, right? Well, this is what we've always done, so it must be the right thing. But it could be, in fact, a wrong thing. Maybe, for example, the church is engaged in something for many years that's not good and needs to be corrected. So, again, watch out for this sort of fallacy. Well, so that's this entire lesson for this week. I want you to enjoy your time, a little bit of extra time on your hands for enjoying Good Friday and Easter Sunday. I know it's a little bit of a strange time for us with COVID and all that's going on. So I pray you guys all stay safe, that you enjoy time with your family, that you find ways to shine as lights in your communities in ways that are safe, and that you would lead other people to know Jesus. We'd be praying that even these circumstances would cause people to realize just that we're just mere men, right? We're finite, and we're in need of a Savior. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.